Hello everyone, this is a video for Tuesday of Holy Week. The days, I don't know about you, but I'm finding myself slightly confused as to what day it is just at the moment, but this is the video for Tuesday. And as we did yesterday, we're looking through Mark's Gospel to see what happens to Jesus in that final week leading up to Good Friday and the crucifixion. And the answer is that on that Tuesday, Jesus has a very busy day. He does a lot of preaching, lots of parables, lots of answering questions, lots of arguing and debating. So a long and difficult day for Jesus. We will get into that in a moment, but first I did say yesterday we'd come back to the question of the fig tree because it's a story that started on one day but not complete until the other day, with another story coming in the middle. And it's a curious story because it seems Jesus is annoyed that there are no figs on this tree, but Mark tells us that it was not the season for figs. There aren't going to be any figs because it's the springtime, it's the Passover. It's not the season for figs to be harvested. So why is he angry about this? Well, in the book that I recommended last week, Borg and Crossan take this as a sign. This story is not to be taken literally, because if we try and take it literally, Jesus is angry at a fig tree not bearing figs in the season for figs. It doesn't really make much sense. Rather, they suggest it's about the temple. And if you remember, the story about the cleansing of the temple comes in the middle of the two halves of this story about the figs. And so the fig tree there represents the temple. And of course, this is not the only parable that Jesus tells on this particular day. There's lots of parables, but also lots of questions. So Jesus answers and is asked many questions by different people and for different reasons. Now, of course, there are lots and lots of types of questions, and indeed, as the old song has it, there are more questions than answers. Sometimes we ask questions because we genuinely want to know the answer, or we're genuinely interested in how that person is going to answer and what they're going to have to say on the matter. But sometimes we ask rhetorical questions, which are not really questions at all, or at least not actually designed to be answered. We're told on this day that Jesus delights the crowd at one point by asking, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? That's not a real question. Then there are questions which are designed to trap somebody. Questions designed so that there's no answer that will be considered acceptable. Now, we see questions in our world like that asked often by journalists or sometimes by politicians to other politicians. And questions not really designed to find out information, but to try and force somebody into a damaging statement. And of course, those sort of questions are not always answered. Sometimes people choose not to answer, or to answer the question that they rather wish that they'd asked or been asked, rather than the one they actually have been asked. And in this case, of course, Jesus' opponents are trying to get him to say something which will incriminate himself, something that's going to be sufficient to get him arrested, which might be by upsetting the Jewish authorities, or indeed by questioning Roman rule and therefore upsetting the Romans. So when Jesus is asked about paying taxes, is it lawful, is it correct to pay the taxes or not? This is intended as a trap. This is a question for which there is no good answer. Because if Jesus says that it's okay to pay the tax, he's essentially supporting collaboration with the Romans. He's accepting the legitimacy of Roman rule. If he says no, he's advocating sedition against the Romans by not paying their taxes, which is also going to get him into trouble. So it's supposed to be a question which can't be answered either way. So what does Jesus do? Well, perhaps a little bit like a politician on Newsnight, he doesn't really answer the question, or at least he replies with an answer that's deliberately confusing and troubling. He says, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things which are God's. So he answers his own question rather than the one that he has been asked, because ultimately he thinks that's a more important question. Later in the week, of course, he'll appear before Pontius Pilate, and there he simply rejects Pontius Pilate's authority and refuses to say anything, refuses to answer any questions. He rejects earthly power, and in particular the power of the Roman Empire altogether. So Jesus is asked lots of questions. He asks some of his own, Some of these are genuine questions, some are designed as traps, but it's in response to one of the more genuine questions that we get a really important moment. So somebody asks Jesus, which is the most important commandment? And of course in the Jewish scriptures there are many, many commandments to choose from, and this seems to be a genuine inquiry. Even here Jesus doesn't quite answer the question, because he responds to the question about which is the greatest commandment by offering two commandments, although you could say that they perhaps are the same. He tells his listeners that they should love God and love their neighbour. So those are the two most important commandments, to love God and to love your neighbour as yourself. And of course so much of Christianity comes out of those two simple statements. So much of what we do as Christians, what we do as the church, is an attempt to follow those two commandments in all sorts of different ways. So I think today we could particularly think about how can we follow those two commandments, and particularly how can we love our neighbour at a time of social distancing when we have to stay at least 2 meters apart. And of course today, as always, would be a good day to pray for our neighbours and indeed to pray for ourselves, because we need to always remember that if we are to love our neighbours as ourselves, that means that we have to love ourselves first. So those are some topics that we can think about today. And also we could think about questions. If you could ask a question of Jesus, what would you ask? And how would you hope he answers it? But of course, as we've seen, Jesus often doesn't answer the question that people asked, or at least he gives them an answer which they're not expecting and which they're not always very happy with. So those are just a few thoughts about Mark's Gospel and the Tuesday of Holy Week. I really have forgotten what day it is, and we'll be back tomorrow thinking about what happens next. So until tomorrow, thank you for watching. Goodbye.